just imagine or empathize with the psychopath. I have no value if I die, I don't care. Versus if someone else dies, I don't care because they have no value. That's different. And you would not survive in corporate with the mindset like that.
Hi, this is your project management cowboy coming back to you with another podcast. In this podcast, we are going to talk about personality assessment tests. Why? Because I had the fortunate opportunity with a client and with some colleagues of mine to take part in one of these personality tests. I'm going to tell you which one, and I'm going to show you what psycho results I got. A joke aside, this has always been a topic that has been of interest to me because every once in a while a client will come to me and say, listen, we need to develop our teams. Is there any way to assess them? So that's kind of the motivation behind this. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of literature available on Amazon if you go out there and see what's out there. So what I'd like to do in this podcast that's following up with Karina, Olivier, we're going to be talking about a specific personality test that we were actually trained in, but I also want to give you kind of introduction to what's out there because we're not really promoting one system or the other. So let's get ahead of it. Personality profile tests, okay? Interesting fact, supposedly there's about 2,500 different ones out there right now. Now that doesn't make it all the more easier. I'm going to make it easy for you. I'm going to give you the short list. There's about 6 or 7 of the big boys and girls that we're going to take a look at. They're primarily used in a business setting for hiring process, for developing teams, for developing training programs. That's kind of the motivation behind it, okay? They're supposed to give you kind of a unique insight. They're supposed to kind of accelerate the process when you're interviewing someone or you're giving a 360 feedback. They're kind of supposed to set the tone, create a framework, create a vocabulary in which to discuss the basic capabilities and orientations of individuals, okay? Like I said, they're used very strongly for job seeking, and Psychology Today reports that about 80% of Fortune 500 companies use some form of these one way or the other. I will say this though, I recently picked up on Instagram somebody from an Ivy League university in the United States, and they questioned him about these personality tests, and he says, you know what? When I was doing my MBA and when I was doing my PhD, there's not a lot of conversation about this in the academic world, which is interesting, but still in the business world, this comes up quite often. What is the purpose of the test? A quick assessment, a kickstart to constructive conversation. This is kind of my definition, and I like this definition because this was my experience when I did when I was doing my certification for the personality test that we're going to take a look at later. I had to actually assess somebody based on their results. And I thought the greatest thing about it was that it gives you kind of a head start. It gives you a kind of some homework to get into before you sit down with a person. It's not 100% indicative of what the person is really like, but it gives you a ground to start off with and actually ask more questions than to make determinations, okay? It helps you with hiring decision. It helps you with coaching and mentoring. It helps you develop capability development plans for individuals or for teams. It's great for team building. We're going to take a look at one particular one that I'm also familiar with, the Belbin test, which is great for assessing teams. It's great for leadership development and mentoring. And it's also great for personal growth. I think it's sometimes valuable to take a look at your own personality test. And I think the greatest value to individuals is to reflect, does this really reflect, does this resonate with me? Is this accurate? Okay, because there are some cases where it might not, okay? Disclaimer, there's always a disclaimer with this thing. There's 2 terms that are always used in personality tests, and one of them is called validity and the accuracy. These are 2 scientific terms that are used. Now, you might find this interesting, but if your psychological profile that you're using has an accuracy of about 30%, that is considered fairly high, okay? There's a number of different variables that affect validity and accuracy, but we'll take a look at that a little bit later on. What also has a big result is the environment that you're working in. I think anybody who's ever taken one of these personality tests several times will know that through the history of your career, your profile might change depending on what type of job you're working with, what the culture of your company is, whether you're working in a dynamic or critical or stressful environment. All of these things kind of play a role. The semantic understanding of the questions that are asked to be able to assess you are also a big thing, right? We'll take a look at that a little bit later on as well. Culture has a role, and your present life conditions we've already talked about. Tests can mislead. They're not an absolute 100% bullseye of what's going on in your life, but they're a great place to start a conversation from. Another thing I'd like to say is remember that people can change and evolve. And this is the last point is very, very important. A test does not test whether you are a good person or a bad person. It doesn't necessarily test whether you're a good employee or a bad employee. It takes a look at your preferences. It takes a look at how you perceive your role in the world. But it's not so much a judgment, which I think is really, really important to say, okay? I have, of the 2,500 that are out there, picked out the big boys and girls, okay? I had ChatGPT help me with this, right? So Myers-Briggs indicator, also called MBTI, classic. A lot of American companies use this. A lot of multinational companies use this. This is a big one. Interesting enough, in the conversation that we're going to have with Karina later on, she's going to point out that the ones that have the greatest scientific relevance and validity are ones that are primarily based on this model right here, which is called the Big Five personality test. You might be familiar with the book, The Big Five. Okay, we'll take a look at that. Also called Ocean. Then there's DISC assessment. We have the Belbin. I'm going to add two that maybe you're not so familiar with. One, which we are going to have a podcast with an expert in a couple weeks from now. It's called the Process Communication Model. I really like this one because it's kind of pragmatic. And then the one we're going to take a look at in the actual podcast that's coming up is the Personality and Preference Inventory, also called P.A.P.I, okay? Now I might need to intone the I there. P.A.P.I, it's not a Latino personality test. It's a broad across all cultures. I thought that was funny. I thought I'd throw that in. I used to work in Miami, so shout out to my Cuban friends in Miami.